Firstly, I'd like to say good afternoon to you all. My name is Rowan Toll. I'll be your host for today's AI event. I'd firstly like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet today. I also acknowledge that we have a number of parties joining us remotely today from other regions of Queensland and Australia, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of those regions and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So welcome to the Queensland AI Hub and our inaugural Straight Out of Queensland webinar series. So this series will be a regular webinar to highlight the AI talent and initiatives that are coming straight out of Queensland, demonstrating the amazing capabilities that exist in our people and organisation in this great state. Today's inaugural webinar is coming out of Cairns in far north Queensland, so I'm jealous of that. One of the most biodiverse regions in the world. And we're excited to have Andrew Robinson along to share his story. So Andrew Robinson is the founder and chair of Earth Guardians. He's a champion of environmental conservation through advanced collective intelligence systems. His mobile gaming venture, Quest to Game, is leading the new bioeconomy revolution through the gamification of citizen-led science data collection in mobile phone app that seeks to engage players in their natural environment through education and entertainment and help protect Australia's biodiversity through taxonomy, training and species mapping. Andrew says part of the fun is seeing what other people are discovering. You can even set up quests in other parts of the world so that people can find species which get added to your collection and help increase your overall score. Among other things, some of Andrew's other achievements are he's the Eureka Prize winner in Science Innovation in 2018. He's a 2017 Maya Innovation Fellow, Fulbright Fellow in Digital Communication, Masters in Communication Science, Columbia University, New York, founder and chief developer of Quest to Game, born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. We won't hold that against him. And then 5 years in India, 13 years in New Zealand as it became a Kiwi citizen, and 11 years in Australia. So I'd like to hand over now and welcome Andrew Robinson. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share the presentation here and get this up and going. Is that all good? Yeah? All right. Well, thank you, Rowan. I'm really honored to be the first guest, the inaugural guest of this Straight Out of Queensland series. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic series. I'm looking forward to listening to more great events. And I also want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the Cairns region, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the Yidinji people and the Bama groups all around the Wet Tropics region, and the elders past, present, and emerging. All right, so yes, the accent is American. I'm in Cairns, this is where I'm based, but the accent is American, it's not Canadian. And yes, if you detect a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, but sort of an idealistic, hippie-ish, change the world type of tone to my voice, that's the San Francisco part of me, which you know, the overconfidence, bravado, where I was born and raised. So yeah, so I would say there are really two items of my youth that are of interest to this presentation. The first one is that when I was 17, I hiked the entire Sierra Nevada mountain range. It's a 300-mile walk. It took a month, and it's called the John Muir Trail. So that was one thing that sort of shaped my identity when I was young. And the second thing was that during that walk, I spent most of the time kind of thinking about how much I missed playing computer games back home on my father's Apple II computer. So these are some of the cool games that I played at the time. I don't know if these bring back memories for anybody, but I look at this and I get very fond memories. And I think the combination of these two things, the gaming and the nature, have kind of played out a bit in my life and informed my current work. So yeah, as Rohan said, I studied at Columbia University in New York City. This is where I did my graduate studies. And I studied under a guy named James Carey, brilliant guy, who really opened up my mind to communication systems and what I would call today communication science. And he was sort of the first one to point out that communication shapes how we are as people. And he particularly pointed to the telegraph system. And he showed, and this was before Twitter or the texting or anything, but he showed that these systems actually change the way we talk and the way we write. And after the telegraph, you read books and all the sentences suddenly became much shorter. So he was a pioneer in that field and sort of opened my mind to this whole way of looking at communication, especially people like Marshall McLuhan, and today James Glick would be another person that is sort of looking at communication science in how it impacts us as humans. I think the other thing I should not forget to mention about Columbia was this is where I met my wife. She was studying physics, and she was a master's in physics, and she is today a PhD in citizen science and computer systems. We've been working together all this time, and we founded the company together, and we work on communication science, and we're very boring to be around because all we talk about is work and technology. So I got really interested in collective intelligence, and I'll just quickly explain what that is, in the sense that maybe I'll explain what it's not. So while I started with collective intelligence, and that was really my interest, what I was seeing the internet becoming at that time, and it was still emerging, but was more of the sort of crowdsourcing Facebook style, and Google was doing this as well, which is more of a popularity engine. So it's really about who you know, and these early systems like LinkedIn and these social networks began forming, which were really about more about who you know than what you know, and about how popular you were, so how many followers and so on. But a collective intelligence system is really looking at what you know and how much trust you've instilled, your expertise has instilled. The term collective intelligence has kind of changed, and so now I prefer the term collective expertise. But the difference is, one is more about popularity and thumbs up and upvotes and things like that. The other one is more about trying to produce super intelligence and expertise that you cannot get otherwise. So in that sense, it's very much in the camp of AI, in that we're talking about achieving super intelligence. So basically, my wife and I took communications, these collective intelligence systems. I mean, you basically have two options when you're doing what I was doing. You can write books about collective intelligence, or you can start building your own systems. We chose to build our own systems, so we built them in India. We built it a bit in New Zealand, and then we came to Australia. And if you come to Australia after you've been in New Zealand for a while, what really strikes you is the diversity of species here. Nothing against New Zealand, it's a beautiful place, but when we came to Canberra, we were just struck by, in our backyard, how many species there were, the bird life, the insect life, the plants. And we ended up wanting to sort of study all of this, and we kind of felt like Joseph Banks, the great botanist, the first Western botanist to come to Australia. And that's why I put his photo there. And what really struck me as we were studying these is how little we knew. This here is a fiddler beetle. And you can kind of get a sense of why it's called that, because of the lines on its casing resemble a fiddle. And this is very unique to Australia. So I don't know how many of you have seen these, but you should look out for them. You won't find them anywhere else. And what's interesting is that Joseph Banks never saw this. He described, a couple hundred species while he was here. But the more you start to look at these things, the more you realize how little you know about them. And one of the things that occurred to me early on as we were looking at these species and as they were being submitted to our system later was that these species have been studied for 40 to 50,000 years. So Joseph Banks was a newcomer. He found a few species and went home and is now considered a great botanist, which fair enough he was, and he was also a wealthy guy who invested a lot of his money in studying species. Hats off to him. But he missed so much because he did not talk to anybody who already had seen these species and had been studying them for thousands and thousands of years. So that really kind of struck me at the time. And I remember thinking about that as we started our venture called Quest a Game, which is a collective intelligence system, but it's really a game to get people outdoors. And the idea was that, you know, we can't monitor all the species in Australia, but if you get people engaged, kind of like a Pokemon Go style system, the people could do that. And the more you can map the biodiversity and all the different species, and the more you can learn about it, you've not only got human engagement and concern and caretaking happening, but you also are getting a map, kind of like a weather map of the biodiversity, and you can start to see what sort of decisions need to be taken to help protect it. So that's Quest a Game. It's all about getting people outdoors. And this game grew, you know, pretty well. It's in over 40 countries now. It's taken off pretty strongly in Australia. This is a map of all the Quest a Game activities. It's pretty recent. What's interesting too is that it's being cited, the data that we collect, we actually share with the Atlas of Living Australia and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And this data is being cited in a lot of scientific papers as well. So then we came up to Queensland, our favorite state of existence. And this was part of a Queensland grant from the government that was trying to bring in innovative companies into the region, and so we jumped on board to that. You know, a lot of people think of us as Quest a Game, but what we really are is this collective intelligence technology that sits behind the game. The game is just an interface to motivate and, you know, let people have fun and educate people about nature. But we also have this other technology that sits behind it that's really kind of what we're talking about today. So this is what we call the Bioexpertise Engine, and you're welcome to look it up. It's bee.questagame.com. And these are where all the sightings of the photographs are coming in of all the species. And this system is basically doing a lot of different things. You'll notice, if you're not sure how well you can see it, but each one of these sightings has a value attached to it, and it actually has a dollar value and a biocoin value. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but the dollar value is what we pay out to conservation organizations. So if you're participating in the system, you select a conservation organization that you want to support, and then we make a donation on your behalf. But what happens with these collective intelligence systems is you get them working correctly, is that you can actually create a kind of economy here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to go too deep into it, but the point is that this system is actually probably the most advanced in the world in terms of identifying and gathering information about species observations. So I'll just explain really generally what we mean by a collective expertise system that's looking at species. So you basically have someone who is asking a question, what is this thing that I've just seen? And the system now goes, well, who is this person that's asking it, and how important is it, this thing that they've seen? This is a really important aspect of collective intelligence, is to understand the urgency or the priority or the expertise requirements for every query that comes onto the system. We often have this illusion that, and you know, Mark Zuckerberg kind of contributes to this when he talks about Facebook being a public square, or, you know, these social networks being connecting the world. In fact, that's not really the case. Some people have a louder voice and some people have a softer voice. In a popularity engine, it's who's the most popular, who's the influencer, that's who's going to have the louder voice. In an expertise engine, it's which question is the most important to the system. This is a really important aspect, and I can't emphasize it enough, but that's step one. Once it's figured out how important that question is, it then looks around the network and it figures out who's the best person to respond to that question. And it tries to motivate them to do so. And these motivations, you know, you've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's lots of things that motivate people in different ways. It could be financial. It could be a sense of doing a social good. It could be that you just want to learn more about the species. It could just be that you want to make friends on the system. There's lots of things that motivate, but our system is trying to work across all of those, but it has to motivate the people to respond. So I'll give you some examples here. I don't know why I chose 2 examples, but I think they fit on the screen that way. But so anyways, the idea is we've got 2 sightings here, just sort of randomly taken from the system. One is of a dolphin, one is of a stick insect called the peppermint stick insect that's native to Queensland. You've got the photos. You can submit up to 5 photos per observation, and then you've got the location data. We have information about who submitted this, what their level is in that category of expertise. And sometimes they will say, I think it's this, but they don't have to. They don't have to give any information. Sometimes they give field notes, but a photo is enough. We're adding video, we're adding sound. So, so we have some information about the player. And then we get all that, then it finds the different experts on the system, and then it gets that information. And then we have information about the experts, so we know what level they are in that category. And then they assess the query. In this case, they're giving it a remarkability rating. They might rate the photo quality, they might rate the field notes, and so on. And in this way, we start to gather information that becomes more super intelligent, you might say. Now, we have lots of examples of how the system is creating super intelligence of a kind. I don't mean super intelligence in the AGI, artificial general intelligence sense. I just mean that the outcomes of this system are more intelligent than individual humans could be, or collective intelligence that's not using this digital communication system. So like an institution, for example. This is a really great example. It's my favorite example. This paper was published just 2 or 3 days ago, in fact. The images of a pygmy grasshopper. It's an Australian species. It's the first ever image of the female pygmy grasshopper. And we got a call about 6 months ago from a university in Germany saying, hey, one of your sightings is really interesting. We want to write a paper about it. Can we contact one of the Quest Game participants and include them as a co-author? And we said, sure, we arranged it. We got in touch with them. And here it is. The paper has now come out about these Australian pygmy grasshoppers. What they didn't realize was that the Quest Game player is 11 years old. So we are now able to connect people in such a way that we're able to get expertise out of places that wouldn't normally be extracted, in this case, young people. And we have schools programs where young people are finding new species, finding invasive species, and that's extremely valuable. And now they're being co-authors of scientific papers as well. All right, so I mentioned to Rohan that I would talk about reality mining. I may have bitten off a bit more than I could chew here, but I'll give it a go. Because this really gets to the sort of machine learning side of AI. And when I talk about reality mining, the person I like to refer to here is a woman at Harvard University named Shoshana Zuboff, who has written a fantastic book called Surveillance Capitalism. Highly recommend this if you haven't read it. It is sort of the best book that kind of traces the rise of Google and you know, the internet, and how the system has become basically a surveillance system for profit, which, you know, for advertisers. Fair enough. So surveillance is basically monitoring the activity of our computers and what we do online. Reality mining is basically mining what the data that we gather about the reality around us, right? So we're taking lots of photos of all these insects and things. And this example that I have here, so we've plugged in an AI system that's a global AI. So it's looking at photos from all over the world in a repository that's actually based out of Copenhagen. But that is called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And we plugged in the AI. So if you use Question Game now, the machine learning will come back to try to identify the species for you. And it's come back as Apis mellifera. It has 5 photos, and you can see photo number 4. It's 96% confidence, according to that algorithm, of it being Apis mellifera, which is actually the Western honeybee. This is not that. Those of here in Australia, we know that this is the blue-banded bee, Amygdala cingulata. It's very special to this place. There's no other, this bee does not exist anywhere else. The global system, though, however, has mostly Western North American data. So it's assuming that this is a Western honeybee. And that's fine. We can try to correct that. It's not going to be easy. This system at the moment is used by Microsoft and Google, and they're telling everybody that this is actually a Western honeybee. And that's also okay, except that there will be people who believe that it's a Western honeybee, and next time they see it, they will identify it as such, and that will reinforce the API, the AI, the machine learning, to identify it as such. And eventually this could become the Western honeybee and no longer be the blue-banded bee, right? I don't think that's going to happen, but that's an example of how reality mining can lead to reality distortion. So you have a lot of taxonomists in Australia saying, we want to identify all the species across Australia, but there's also big players out there that are doing that now, and they may decide what the species is, whether or not the scientists agree. Okay, I can talk about that a little bit later if I kind of rushed it. But I think this guy, Daniel Dennett, says it really clearly. The real danger is that we will overestimate the comprehension of our latest thinking tools, prematurely ceding authority to them beyond their competence. And I think that's right, not just because he looks like a Western philosopher, an avuncular kind of guy with a lot of wisdom, but I think I've been seeing that happen. Now that's just the bee. I think it's important because it's the blue-banded bee and it's special to the region, but these are invasive species that our system has found. And it becomes very important, for example, for that wasp in the top right that was found by our system in Melbourne, that this is accurate, because that wasp could do a huge amount of damage to the wineries in that region. The beetle on the bottom left could devastate parts of Brisbane. The yellow crazy ant, for example, if that's not picked up by correctly or is misidentified, could wipe out the wet tropics here, which is a $6 billion asset in Queensland. And it could go the other way too. You could have a system saying that a fruit fly is in Victoria when it's actually not that fruit fly, but that could stop trade with Japan, produce trade instantly, because Japan wouldn't want to trade with Australia. So it can have huge economic impacts. Reality distortion can have huge economic impacts. And I'll just give a really good example of the difference between having people involved and having AI at analyzing things. So we received this spider, and I think this is a good example. This is a Sparacidae huntsman spider. A lot of people viscerally react against spiders. They're, I used to be like that too. They're very disgusting. And I think there's probably people here having a visceral reaction against this spider, but there are other people who are really interested in it. And I think that reaction is a very human reaction, and that's an important part of the experience. And AI, the machines will obviously not have that same reaction. But also the person who observed this spider pointed out that it was walking weirdly and stumbling. Now the machine learning just classifies this as a Sparacidae spider. It goes in the database, that's it. But when a human looks at it, the person noticed that there was this small pseudoscorpion on the spider, and that's why it was walking weirdly. And also that there was probably no other photo of this phenomenon anywhere. So that was something that the humans were able to pick out. And spiders represent a really important part of the ecosystem. You can often determine the health of an ecosystem by looking at spider populations. But not just that, but we're also missing out on all the indigenous information about that spider, because again, people have been observing, indigenous botanists have been observing these spiders for 40 to 50,000 years. And all that knowledge is not coming in to the machine learning. So I'll just give one more quick example. What's happening is people are trying to create a lot of these sort of Shazams of nature, where you take pictures of things and it tells you, hey, this is what you've seen. And this is an example coming out of Cornell in the US. It's been around 3-4 years. It's you take pictures of birds and you map them, and it identifies them for you. And I just sent out a question to about 20 of the participants in one of these groups. And I said, look, if you had a choice between training the AI how to identify the bird, or training another person with equal effort, how to identify birds, and they might not have your experience, which would you prefer? And you can see the results that most people would choose to train other humans. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these sort of intelligence systems. And there are these other things that we should be thinking about, such as celebrating and incentivizing the human mind. I think that's a very good principle to keep in mind. I think there are these other things that are often talked about. I don't think any of this is new to anyone here. One that might be new is I think the importance of outliers. That is something that I think machine learning and collective intelligence really needs to work on. And this brings us to the great year of 2020. Very sorry about this year, everyone. It's been a tough one for all of us. When I see these sorts of things happening, I'm struck by the fact that here we are in 2020, and we're having these major crises happening, and we still don't have a proper expertise engine to address them. Governments do not have them. Large corporations do not have them. I remember when the Deepwater Horizon explosion happened in the Gulf of Mexico, wondering, if BP had had an expertise system in place, they could have quickly come up with an analysis of the problem and a better way to fix it. What was happening was that people were throwing ideas all over the place, CNN, YouTube, Google, wherever, to try to solve this problem. But there was no expertise system. And I thought at that time, well, surely in 10 years, there's going to be one developed. And there still isn't. And these are important. These are really important systems, and they're not expensive to build. We could build it for $10 million in a year. And this would allow us to react to things like COVID-19 or civil rights issues in a way that's much more inclusive, rather than everybody being siloed and trying to solve it with their little AI program or their something else, their IoT device over here. You're able to combine intelligence and come up with solutions. And this is what I think we should be thinking about, and I'll just end with this slide, is really a solutions-based economy. And this comes back to the biocoin that I mentioned earlier. So we use these coins to allow the collective intelligence to operate and motivate people, and to give value to the different sightings that come in and all the expertise that comes in. But at the end of that, you should now be able to, and this is something that will be happening, you will be able to take your earnings and do your grocery shopping with them. So you've contributed to helping save biodiversity, mapping the biodiversity, identifying, ants, finding invasive ants, whatever it may be, but you're earning Biocoin, and these have a real world value because you're contributing to the solutions-based economy. And this can go across all the verticals. You could have it for pandemic, you can have it for civil rights issues, whatever, but your contribution to this is something that you should be rewarded for and should be valued as part of an economic contribution. So I'll just end it there, Rohan. I hope I didn't go too fast or too slow, and please, I'll be really interested in people's ideas and discussing this further.
That's great, Andrew. Thank you for that. If you want to just unshare your screen, and then we can all see you again. So look, we would absolutely encourage any questions from the audience to put forward, and we'll try and get those answered for you. Interesting, Andrew, and I want to talk to you more, and we've obviously had some opportunities to chat, but getting some more of your ideas around how do we better use human intelligence, like in the case you're doing here, to improve and develop better AI tools.
Yeah, so a lot of AI obviously is about tagging things and getting good information. It really comes down to the data, and that's why I would even say that collective intelligence is AI. I think they're the same thing. It's either, it could be seen as a subset of AI, or it could be that AI is a subset of collective intelligence. It's depending how you look at it, right? You're going to need humans in the loop in one way or another. So you're always going to get better outcomes the more humans and the more diversity of humans that you have engaging in the system. You're going to get less bias, and you're going to get just a more intelligent system.
Excellent. And just when you you mentioned earlier about getting the 11-year-old into an academic paper. What are you seeing in the terms of the process of getting people back looking at nature, and what are you seeing is changing in that sphere as people actually start to look at nature again?
Oh, there's lots of changing. We get emails all the time from people who say, hey, I never noticed these things in my backyard. It's like this awakening that happens. There's a sudden connection. So we all have in something in us called biophilia. And that is a term coined by, that was actually created by Edward Wilson, the biologist in the US. And that's an innate connection to nature that we all have. It's part of our genes. But we spend a lot of time looking at screens, and we're doing that more and more now, especially in these times. We're Zooming all the time, so this is becoming our reality. And then we're noticing that there's a lot of mental health issues, and that's not a surprise. So one of the big outcomes that we get is just the joy that people find, the mental peace that people find when they're paying attention to the world around them. It is this kind of awakening and this sort of mental wellness that happens. I would say that's a big one. But there's also just the sense of, oh, I never knew that so many spiders are undescribed, or so many moth species that I'm seeing, excuse me, in my window at night. Science has never described them before, and that I can contribute to that, and that biodiversity is something that I'm a custodian of, and that it's my responsibility really to be engaged. And that there's great outcomes. Obviously, one of the great outcomes was the bushfire recovery, for example. Suddenly, we set up a bushfire recovery BioQuest in those regions, and suddenly everyone was involved in sort of mapping how the nature recovers. So, yeah, I think it's that connection, that sense of connection that people discover.
And have you actually found any new species yet?
Yes, so we have found new species, and we had a young indigenous player actually in Western Australia find a new species of spider. We've had well, a lot of it is these are species that are likely new species, but need to go through the whole process of being, being described. You have to actually capture it physically and send it in, and scientists have to look at it and compare it to all the previous specimens and stuff. That's a long process. It can take a couple years. I would like to see that shortened. I think a lot of this is, again, that's a form of collective intelligence, right? But it's offline. We can modernize that. We're in 2020, and we have issues like, the extinction crisis is real. In this talk, 3 to 4 species have already just disappeared. In this hour talk, that's what's happening. That's how fast species are disappearing. So we can't afford to use outmoded collective intelligence models. This is where we can really accelerate the process. But yes, the answer to your question is, we've had species come in that all the experts say they're very confident that is new species, but it still has to go through the process.
Awesome. So we have got a couple of questions come through. So from just wondering what the relationship of the important notion of accuracy that you're using for the biosphere with more human-related challenges that often have value-related and political issues.
Ooh, that's a really interesting one. So yeah, that's absolutely right. What I didn't say about the Bioexpertise Engine is that it uses a scientific method. So you're right, we're really trying to get accurate data. It's all double-blind peer review. That's really important. It can't be who you know. It can't be, hey, my buddies, we all think it's such and such a species. And we see that on a lot of systems where someone will identify it and everybody jumps on the bandwagon and says, oh, it must be that because so-and-so has said it is. The minute you make a double-blind peer review, you suddenly start getting a lot of interesting disagreements. So at the end of it, we come up with some really accurate data. But you're right. If this data comes and it says that this is an invasive species, we do get a lot of pushback. No, not a lot, but occasionally from, say, biosecurity, not necessarily wanting to know that that's there because there are political issues about it, or you determining what is a threatened species will also be an issue. So our role here is to just try to get it as accurate as possible to map reality as accurately as we can. But yes, there are all kinds of political issues that we're starting to see more and more that a lot of times I don't even notice until suddenly I realize, oh, our data has been manipulated over there, or nobody wants to know that issue, or these sorts of things. So there are a lot of political issues, but I think what it comes down to is that the more people are engaged and the more you can get that sort of trust built in that this is double-blind peer review, it's objective science, the harder it is to argue with.
Awesome. And I hope I say this right. I think it's Priyanka is asking, and this is a really solid question because I think it's really important for the industry of artificial intelligence. Is how do you see AI being used for environmental sustainability? And there's probably many ways you can take this question, but I'll let you go whichever way you want to go.
So, yeah, so the question of AI, how do I see AI being used? I think it's really important, first of all, whenever we use the term AI, we run into all kinds of weird issues. And I think I've got to start with that. It's actually such a broad stage when we talk about AI that it can be very difficult to give a narrow answer. So on the one hand, you've got people, like serious intellectuals like Steven Pinker, Stuart Russell. You've got the great cognitive scientist, Gerald Edelman. All these people would probably say that AI doesn't really exist yet. And it's probably not going to exist for 50 to 100 years. And what they're talking about is super intelligence or artificial general intelligence, right? And fair enough, they're basically saying, look, the only intelligence we know is human intelligence. And these systems are nowhere near that. If you think of the work of Alison Gopnik at Berkeley, she studies the brains of 5-year-old kids, the neuroscience of 5-year-old kids. And I get people all the time saying to me, hey, AI computer vision is as good as a young child now. And she just completely destroys that idea and says it's nowhere near a 5-year-old ability. It's nowhere near. So you got those people on one camp that AI doesn't even exist. It's not going to exist for a long time. And then you've got people on the far other side of the spectrum that are basically saying AI's always been around. It's always been around. James Glick would be an example of that. That these systems are just augmented intelligence. If you look at there's a rock formation down in Victoria that is an Aboriginal rock formation that was actually probably the oldest observatory known on the planet that can tell you when the summer solstice is going to happen, when the winter solstice is going to happen, and the equinox. You could look at that system as artificial intelligence. And you could say, well, it's smarter than the people because it could actually give you a really good idea of the summer solstice, better than people can. So it's smarter. All of this is augmented intelligence. Ultimately, so to wrap this up and try to answer your question and bring this to sustainability, it's the human that we have to think about, because all of this has the human in the loop. So the answer is, the way I see it, is the more humans, because we have all these supercomputers in people's skulls, 7.5 billion supercomputers around the planet. The more they are engaged, the more of them engaged in sustainability and the SDGs, the more likely we are to achieve sustainability with AI. So I hope, I don't know if that answers the question. It's just that when you start with AI, I think we got to think of the full spectrum and then think of how important it is for humans to be engaged, not rely on machines. I'll give you a quick example. Suppose we had a machine that had every species mapped in it. And there are scientists who want to do this, by the way. One machine. I honestly think if we ask that machine, what's the best way to protect biodiversity from an extinction crisis, the machine would probably come back and say, probably the answer is to stop asking machines to solve your problem. Got to be the human. So sorry if I went around in circles on that one, but that's my answer.
We've had some conversations here before, Andrew, so I wanted to give you free rein on that one.
Okay.
We've actually got the Bayside group. They're actually obviously playing Quest a game, ranked 64. So maybe you can just explain a little bit of the ranking there, just to give us some context around that. And they mentioned something about the Australian Living Atlas, so maybe you could just talk to that a little bit.
Right. So we have a couple ranking mechanisms, like in any game that you play, you go up levels. We have experience levels, which is, how many, how much activity you've been engaged in the game. We have expertise levels, which show how much you know about the different categories. So there's, I think, 18 different categories of life on our system. We cover everything: plants, animals, fungi, every category, really. So those levels are based on basically how you perform in the system, and as you move up the levels, you get special abilities in the game. The Atlas of Living Australia is the Australian is run out of CSIRO, and it's the Australian database of species, and then they connect to something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So all our data we share with the Atlas, not all of it. Some players prefer not to share their data, which is great. So we give them that option. I mean, that's fine. They don't have to. But a set of it does go to the Atlas for research and conservation. And then that data then goes to the global one.
Excellent. And it's Martin Rady. That's Bayside Group. So I'm not sure whether you know Martin or not.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's. I mean, there's lots of areas that we, as I said, we've had a few opportunities to chat about along the way. But the interesting story, I guess, that comes back to mind and probably, give us somewhere to loop back to, is your journey that got you to where you are now, your personal journey. So I'd I think that that'd be a really good thing to share, and how that's helped you get to where you are as a subject matter expert, and the value of subject matter experts in this context of, artificial intelligence and the use of platforms like Quest to Gain to enhance that. So you want to talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So a lot of the journey has been building these collective intelligence systems and testing them on a lot of people. When we were in India, we actually built one of the first collective expertise systems for the Indian community, which was really it started off looking at cooking recipes and things like that. Because what we were noticing in India was that there was a lot of cooking expertise amongst Indian housewives that obviously doesn't have an economic value that is a paid, financed economic value. So these housewives had these amazing abilities, and we thought, well, could we create a marketplace where people could ask questions about cooking Indian food and get these amazing answers? And so we experimented with that, and it was really interesting what happened. And we built that up and then expanded to lots of different categories. But what we were really seeing, it was kind of like that young boy who was able to get a published paper, was that like a housewife in India, it was very clear that she might know more about cooking than like a major celebrity like Nigella Lawson or something like that, or Jamie Oliver. It was just obvious that her skills were just more advanced. And so how could we reward this expertise exchange, so to speak? And then it expanded to lots of different categories. We had over, I think it was something like 2 million people come onto the system over time. And through that, we were able to sort of figure out what sort of algorithms we should be writing. And a lot of those are what are called consensus algorithms. They're used a lot in blockchain as well, but they're really trying to figure out what a consensus means and how do you achieve consensus for expertise. So I guess, what I'm saying is a lot of it's just been building our laboratories to study this stuff. Because you can look at other laboratories, and most of academia does that. They look at other laboratories like Facebook and so on. But it's different when you can build your own and then test different things. And a lot of Quest to Gain is a lot of testing, and sometimes I have to apologize to the users because things go wrong now and then, but we're really trying to improve it all the time. So a lot of the journey for my wife and myself has been this constant iteration of these laboratories. So yeah, it's kind of been a life's work.
Yeah, and I mean the conversation that we had around understanding the subject matter expert, I think there's a lot of people around that misunderstand the value of the person outside of the data scientist in the context. And how do we help people in industry use your example of collective intelligence to better understand their needs and how they can use and augment their own human capital and human intelligence within their organization to better build AI-driven devices to help grow and assist, and obviously ultimately protect the environment better?
Yeah, well, I think this is a good first step with the AI Hub. I think we need to talk about it more. We need to include collective intelligence as an AI system, and start applying it to, like, you could have an AI vertical in collective intelligence that just gets people, subject matter experts, working to solve problems together. I saw this with COVID-19. There's something called citizen science. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that, where it's basically trying to get people to work together to do science. I think there's some really good examples there. With COVID-19, there were forums starting up that were solving all kinds of interesting issues, creating masks. This was in the early days, like, printable masks and all kinds of things that were just people getting on and working together in forums and stuff. So, I think there needs to be more of that. There needs to be an understanding. I wonder if I can show this one slide. I think might be helpful. Let's see if I can show this. Can you see the slides?
Yep. It's got the BioCoin one.
Yeah. No, it's not going to be able to. Let me see. I've got this other. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to have it, but I guess one way to think about it is you've got all these AI programmers who really don't have much domain expertise in, say, the humanities or philosophy. And then you've got a lot of people in the humanities and philosophies who really don't have much domain expertise in AI programming. Both sides will say that you need the other. So they'll say that it's really important to have these. And I think you want that. So if you think of like that there, someone with high AI knowledge is sort of here on the graph on the top left. And then, someone with high humanities knowledge is over here on the bottom right. That curve kind of goes like, like this. So if you're way up at the top, you're going to have less of the other. But I think you want to kind of push that curve more towards the middle, so that the people that have a lot of AI knowledge are also getting information from the humanities people, and vice versa. And I think that interdisciplinary study and connecting the different disciplines is extremely important. I mean, our work cuts across biology, economics, computer programming and IT, behavioral psychology, all kinds of things. And I think that's really important that there is that sort of straighter line. I think the idea of pushing it outward, where you could have a whole society of people who have all that kind of knowledge, an outward distribution, I think is asking too much. I don't think, it's really hard there are very few people in the world. I think of Stuart Russell, for example, who is a great philosopher and a great AI programmer. But those are very few and far between. So maybe we're asking too much. So you need the systems to connect those people. And that's really what a collective system is all about.
Awesome, mate. Well, you've done a cracking job, and we really do value your time that you've given us and your knowledge you've shared. And I think, it's been a great start to our Straight Out of Queensland, and we're pleased to call you a Queenslander now. So, thank you very much for your efforts today and time. So what we'd like to do, and we'll get our team to share out some links to everyone who registered and attended today around Earth Guardians and obviously Quest a Game. But we would also encourage you to, if you haven't already, to join up and join our community, the Queensland AI Hub community, and be involved with what we're doing moving forward as we produce and present more of these types of events straight out of Queensland. And, we would like to also hear from those people that are on the call, like what might you be able to share and offer to the community that will add value, just like Andrew has today. So thank you again, mate, for your time, and we really look forward to catching up with you again in the near future.